Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Sisters in Crime Atlanta's October 2022 program of Off the Shelf. We are the Atlanta chapter of the National Sisters in Crime organization, and we have membership that includes authors, but we also have membership that includes readers. And the Off the Shelf program was designed to bring authors to readers. And today I am very excited to have one of our very own members, Liz Lazarus. Liz is a 3-time published author, and she also has a book that she's working on. And we're going to chat with her today about her writing journey and what's coming up for her with her next book. So welcome, Liz. How are you today?
Thank you. I'm doing well.
Good. You look great.
Well, thank you.
I also want to let the audience know, please feel free to engage, ask questions. You can certainly use the chat, but we love it when you participate with us as well. So please feel free to do that. So Liz, let's get started. Because what I always like to do is kick off these programs by asking our authors to tell us something, or not something, tell us about yourself aside from who you are as an author. So in other words, we want your backstory.
Well, that's easy because author is only a small part of what I've been. I went to engineering school at Georgia Tech and spent most of my career in business, 20 years at General Electric in the healthcare division. And got to do a lot of things on my bucket list. I lived overseas in France for 3 years. I got my MBA at Kellogg, sponsored by GE. And then when I finally left GE, part of it was to write my first book, but I also went into consulting, which I did for several years before I worked with 2 healthcare startups. I've done one, and now I'm just now starting the second one. So I call the writing my expensive, time-consuming hobby, but it continues to progress. So and every writing, not about my healthcare startups. So that's what I end up talking about.
Well, I think your backstory is really fascinating. I mean, as you mentioned, you graduated from the Georgia Institute of Technology, and that's pretty impressive. I mean, I know that it floors me. I'm very impressed by anybody who gets to go to that school, much less graduate. So here's what I know. You are from a small town in Georgia, Valdosta, Georgia, South Georgia,
Right.
and somehow you were also salutarian for your
Salutatorian, right? Yeah.
Okay.
Second, which peeves me. By the way, I have to tell you a little bit about my personality.
I love that. I love that. But that also means you were like you said, top of your class, and so what took you from South Georgia? Actually, first, let me ask you this. Why was your family in South Georgia? Why are they in Valdosta?
So my father had a men's clothing store called Lazarus and Sons. Lazarus, it was Joe Lazarus, his father. The sons were my dad and my uncle. And so my father's side had been in Valdosta for a long time. My mother was from Atlanta, and I think they met on a setup date. So mom ended up moving to Valdosta. So that's why we were there. But yes, very small town. It's people know it on I-75 on your way to Florida. People stop either to get gas or because they got a speeding ticket. But yeah, that's how Valdosta is known, and for football, for high school football.
And you have a college there.
We do. Valdosta. It used to be Valdosta State College. Now it's university.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that. So you're right there in Valdosta. There's a college, there's a local college, yet you chose to go to Atlanta, and not only that, to study engineering. Tell us a little bit about that navigation.
Well, I always knew I wanted to get out of small town. Nothing against Valdosta, but my dad used to take me to the apparel mart for his trips, business trips, and I loved Atlanta. It was so thriving. So I always knew I wanted bigger city. And, uh, and the college choice was pretty easy. My dad said, I'll pay for Georgia Tech. Anything else, you're on your own. So that was easy. I did think about a journalism degree for a little bit, but he said, do the hardest thing you can. You can always do something. I guess he thought journalism was easier. I'm not so sure that's true, but he just said, do the hardest thing you can that will ensure a good career.
Oh, I love that. I've honestly never heard that. I'm gonna write that down. This is the second thing that I'm writing down that Liz has said to me. When we were chatting earlier, she said something and I jotted it. And I jotted it down. But okay, so but you have to have a propensity towards sciences in order to get into Georgia Tech, correct?
Well, and we joke that I got my father's math ability and my mother's writing ability. And if
That's
it had been
great.
the other way around, I wouldn't be going to college at all. But I scored equally on the SAT, math and English. So I really could have gone either way.
Mhm. And you decided on engineering. So what do you think drove you to that degree? And there's different types of genres of engineering. Which engineering did you
So I
fall
did
into?
industrial because it has to do with manufacturing and
Mhm.
organization and efficiency. And I I mean, if you saw the way I lay out a book, it's an Excel spreadsheet, 10 columns long and 50 rows deep. So I kind of have that kind of mind anyway. So industrial engineering was a good fit.
Mhm. I love it. I love it. And it makes sense. At one point, did you think you might be going back to Valdosta and maybe getting involved in the family business a little bit more?
No, and, and it's kind of sad, right? It's a second generation. We didn't take it to a third, but I watched how my dad was the salesperson and the inventory and the finance guy, and he was there every day and running everything. And I actually wanted something different. I wanted big company, which is why I went to GE because I wanted a bigger support system in my career. And I
Mhm.
also worked at the placement center at Georgia Tech my last 2 years, junior and senior. And I was lucky from that. Rosita Smith, who I still keep in touch with, gave me a lot of career advice when I was deciding what company to go to when I was graduating.
So you decide to stay in Atlanta and you embark on a career in General Electric. And you mentioned that they put you through school to get your MBA, or they supported it.
They did that later, but I guess the stay in
Mhm.
Atlanta wasn't quite the case because I joined what was called the Manufacturing Management Program, MMP, which a lot of people know that program. It's 2 year rotational. So the first place they sent me to was Florida, Daytona Beach, with the program. That was the first year, which no complaints. And the second year they sent me to Erie, Pennsylvania.
Oh.
And I was like, who did I offend? I got sent to Erie. I'd never seen that much snow in my life. I mean, I had a members only jacket. That's all I had.
Yeah.
The first day of snow, really big snow, my neighbor who was also at GE said, do you want to ride to work? And I'm like, no, I'll be fine. And he said, I've been digging my car out for 30 minutes. Do you want to ride to work? And I'm like, oh, okay. I had no idea of the snow, but GE moved me in the 20 years I was there 9 times.
Wow. So
So it was,
where else did you go?
I was in Milwaukee, I was in Paris, a stint back to Atlanta. So it was some great locations. I mean, Paris for 3 years was fabulous. And when I came back is when they sponsored my MBA. It was executive, so I went on the weekends down to
Mhm.
Chicago.
What, okay. So where were you when you
At
say
that
down
point,
to
when I moved
Chicago?
back, yeah, when I moved back from Paris, I was back in Milwaukee, which was the
Okay.
headquarters for GE Healthcare,
Okay.
and I went to Kellogg, which was a couple-hour drive south to do the MBA program on the weekends.
Wow. So one of my questions was asking you about going to Paris, and you kind of, told us, you opened that door. So I get it that you went there for work, but tell us more about living there. And earlier you had said it was like a dream and a bucket list. So tell us about.
Oh, it was. Well, I learned to speak French, which I never thought I would learn how to do. I had beginners level, simple things, but I had to speak French at work, so I picked it up. Had a tutor, went to classes, listened to my recordings on the train to work. Our office was in Versailles, or just outside of Versailles, but I lived in the city. And the 3 years was kind of the honeymoon was the first year, traveling, seeing everything, every weekend going somewhere. The second year was more getting into the groove. And then by the third year, it's funny, but you start to notice all the things about America that you miss. Like
Oh,
the conveniences. I mean, things
mhm.
open on the weekends, things open late. I didn't have a car. And so by the third year, I was like, okay, I think now I'm ready to come home. But it was a great experience. I probably saw more of Europe than some of the French because it's the same way with the US. I haven't seen half of what I should see in this country, but when you go to another country, you know you have a limited time to explore.
Yeah, and you want to do as much of it as you can for
Right.
sure. So that, and so do do you get, when you decided, well, you said like the third year, you were like, okay, I'm ready to come back to the United States. Do you get to ask to come back, or do you have to wait until they say, okay, the gig is up, it's time to go? Because you were there for 3 years and you said before, I think you said there were 2-year rotations. So you got an extra year in there.
Well, that point, I was off the MMP program, so
Oh,
this was just a general expat. But for
mhm.
expats, I was actually only supposed to go a year, and then it turned into 2, and then into 3. So, and at that point, the my carte de séjour, which was my work permit, was up. So I
Ah.
couldn't have stayed longer. So the French government decided it was time for me to come back. Um,
And so when you came back, you went to Milwaukee and then eventually you came back to Atlanta. And so tell us what happens next in Liz Lazarus' life.
Well, so yeah, I was back to Milwaukee for a job, a Six Sigma job I did my Kellogg MBA, and then that the first part of my career was more back office. It was supplier quality, operations, purchasing, logistics. I did logistics when I was in France, and then the second half of my career at GE was out in the field. So I was able to take a job in the service business and with the Southeast Zone. So I was able to come back to Atlanta, which was great. I mean, it was coming home. And then the second part of my career was actually, though, forgot this. I got pulled back to Milwaukee one more time because I took a national job to run all of the cardiology service, and that was required to be back in Milwaukee. So there was one more step back to Milwaukee. I had just bought my house, and it was in
Oh,
2004. I
yeah.
had just bought the house. I hadn't even moved in yet, and I got the call to go back to Milwaukee for an executive job. And so I was like, all right. So I rented the house out for 2 years, did that job, and then finally got to come back here.
Are you still in that same house?
I am.
That's awesome. It was meant to be
It
then.
was right.
A
Yeah.
little bit of a hiccup, but hey, in the long run, it was meant to be. Well, it really sounds fascinating. And when you talk about it, you seem so enthusiastic. And so were you passionate about your job, or were you just so involved in it that it was who you are and what you did?
Probably a little of both. I mean, it was GE was a great training ground, but it was tough. I mean, we you had to stay on your toes, and I mean, we used to joke that the only day off was Saturday, because Sunday you were actually working again to get ready for Monday, and you didn't. Monday just came like a storm. But no, I was passionate about it, especially when I was running service for cardiology, because I got to go into hospitals and see the procedures and see the physicians saving lives. So it was a tough company, high standards, but it was a great learning experience, and it was a springboard for me to go into consulting later because so many things I learned at GE I was able to use in my consulting career.
So when did you make that segue into
It was in
consulting?
2008.
Okay. So now let's start talking about how you went from this honestly fascinating, interesting, high level activity career into writing. So tell us about that journey, that transition.
Well, I'm probably the most reluctant writer you're going to meet. I tried not to write the first book, and it was a calling, is all I can say. And when you have a calling, at some point you have to listen, because I was doing everything on my bucket list, getting my MBA and living in France, and the book kept calling me to write it. And it got to the point where I was like, okay, it was a joke. It was that or run a marathon, and I didn't want to run a marathon, so I was like, okay, I'll work on the book, and that's when I actually asked GE if I could take a leave of absence to finish Free of Malice, which was my first book. I took the leave of absence. It took about 3 months to finish it because I'd been poking at it for years. But then I ended up going into consulting and not going back. But Free of Malice was based on a real story, and I can tell you more about it. And I think that's why it was a calling, because I had the plot, I had the ending, I had the characters. I just didn't have the time to write it. And that's when I finally said, okay, I'm going to take the time and write it.
So, we can talk about that a little bit more. And as you and I have already spoke of, people do know that your first book, Free of Malice, was inspired by something very personal that happened to you, and that is why it was your calling, and that's why you were so compelled to tell the story. And but you wrote it as fiction. And in a lot of ways, though, it was therapeutic for you because it helped you deal with, I'm assuming, post-traumatic stress.
Very much so. And I probably didn't realize it at the time. Well, writing, I knew, was kind of my therapy too. So the backstory for folks that don't know was when I was at Georgia Tech my senior year, I was living off campus in Home Park in a little house with 2 other women. And in the middle of the night, a guy broke in through the kitchen window and picked my room, kicked open my door, and attacked me. And, you know, I didn't even know what I was made of. I never even dreamed something like that would happen, but I had it within me to fight back. So I started fighting back. And I guess at some point he decided I was too much trouble and making too much noise because I was screaming, and he left. So I grabbed a can of mace I had and chased him to the door and watched him disappear into the night. I called my neighbor. He came over. We called the police. We found where he had broken in through the window. We found where he had a kitchen steak knife wrapped in a dish towel, which thank God I didn't know he had. And but there wasn't much the police could do. I couldn't describe him. It was dark. He got away. So, and there was a little bit of a, well, you weren't raped, get over it. And it wasn't a mean sentiment. It was just kind of how people thought in the day. And so for me, I was like, well, okay, you get over it. You know, you're okay, get over it. But I did have PTSD. I didn't even know what that word was. So I started to journal to get it out of my system, like what happened, how I felt, how I couldn't sleep, how I couldn't be left alone, I couldn't be in the dark. And then my mother had asked me a question. My parents came up and my mother asked me a question. And I thought, wow, that would make a killer ending to a story, what you just asked me, which I won't tell you because it's a twist.
Yeah, then, no spoilers.
And then I had also said, I had said to my brother-in-law, if I had a gun, I would have shot the guy, you know, instead of that can of mace. And he said, well, the way you described it, by the time you could have shot him, he was off your property running away. You would have shot him in the back. That's self-defense. And I didn't think about that. So the book was really my discovery, my research into what's that line between self-defense and vigilantism, and what would have happened to my character or me had I shot him. So that's the story in the book. The protagonist is a journalist. She writes this, her name's Laura. She writes a legal case of what would have happened had she killed her assailant. And she goes through EMDR therapy, which is a therapy I never went through, but it's a good therapy for PTSD. And she also works with a young lawyer, a young Black lawyer, who is very helpful in the laws of self-defense, but he knows more about her in that night than he should. And it starts to freak her out.
So one of the things that I have noticed in looking into your books is that you seem to write about some really heavy topics, and some of them a little bit controversial. And so, and starting with Free of Malice. Now we know that wasn't your intention when you started that book. You started that story to, as we mentioned, as a form of therapy. But it did raise an interesting question in your mind, like, hey, wait a minute, why are things this way? And so I just know that there's a lot more to your story than overcoming a particular situation in a suspense. Like it's deeper. There's more things to discuss. So there's the victim rights, there's gun rights, there's self-defense. You already mentioned the difference between self-defense and vigilantism. There's PTSD. And so it's not just it's not just a book that kind of talks about, oh, an attack and how somebody gets through it. It really goes deep into things that are thought provoking, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And so you had good success with the book. You're often asked to come speak and talk about your experience, and you still have you have this other job that's waiting for you to come back to, but the writing bug has bit. Like how long did it take from publishing and going through the publishing process to decide to leave GE and do some, and maybe find more time to write more often?
Well, when I took the leave of absence, it was just to write Free of Malice, and I was really one and done. I mean, I don't speak 5 languages. I speak just French. Right? I just picked up one other language, right? So it wasn't like I was planning to become an author. When Free of Malice finally made it out, that was it. You know, that was my intent. I got my book out. That was
Another bucket list check mark.
It was literally the reviews that made me think about, and even just think about writing a second book, because the reviews were great. Much more than I expected. You know, page turner, and I would see can't wait for the next one. Like it was just an assumption.
Yes.
And I was like, well, I was only attacked once. I don't have anything else to write about. But then I was at a book club, and I met one of the people at the book club was Jennifer Ross. She was a captain at the time. I think she was promoted to captain, but she was at the Decatur Police Department, and she invited me to take a class called RAD, which is a rape awareness defense. It's a self-defense class. And so I took the class, and that really became the beginnings of my second book. I thought I can take the material from this class, not sharing the class, but so I started to think I wanted a strong female protagonist. I want a twist ending. Obviously want some conflict. I want a mystery in there. And so that's what started to form the idea for Plea for Justice, which was completely fiction, my second book.
That's the one.
Once I decided to write it, it was less than 6 months.
Wow.
Right. I've been able to most books are less than 6 months to write once I decide to write them. But then it's the editing and the proofreading and the line editing and the content editing and the beta readers, right? The authors here know that, right? That takes twice as long as just writing the book.
Well, we need to hop back over to Free of Malice just real quick, because Gary has a great question, and it was one of mine. So Gary, thank you for bringing it back up. And he's asking for a little bit more information on the EMDR therapy.
So I didn't know about this therapy, and you know, when I was attacked, I didn't even know the word PTSD, and like I said, I just thought I needed to get over it. But I later talked to a friend who was a therapist, and she told me about EMDR. It stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Francine Shapiro invented it in the 1980s. And the way it works is the patient thinks of a traumatic event. And I didn't go through it, but for me and Laura, the character, it would have been his silhouette in the doorway. Like that really traumatized me, to hear the door crash open and see his silhouette in the doorway. So the patient thinks of a traumatic experience. And then the therapist either uses her fingers to go back and forth and you track it, or they can do sound, or they can do touch. And that back and forth motion, that happens while you're thinking of the traumatic image. And the way it works is it'll process that image. It attaches it to other memories to help dissipate it. When Francine Shapiro was writing about it, they couldn't explain why it works. The theory I read that made the most sense was that it has something to do with how you REM sleep. When you have REM sleep, your eyes go back and forth. So there's something about that eye movement that processes trauma. But when I was working with a therapist, an actual therapist, to write the book, she was telling me she had patients that had to wait to do EMDR until after they would do a police lineup, because they didn't want the memory to dissipate. And the best way she could describe it is like that memory, that trauma is stuck on an island, and the EMDR bridges it so you can get off of it. And it supposedly makes the trauma feel like it's years in the past versus so fresh and so recent.
Mm-hmm. And from what you learned about it as part of your writing, do you think that had you engaged in it, had you had that opportunity, that it would have helped you?
Oh, for sure. For sure. And I have my character, Laura, I will say she was a little bit like me because she was resistant to therapy because she didn't think it would do her any good. She
Mhm,
has a comment, well, I have friends. Why do I need a therapist? But her
mhm.
husband encourages her to go to therapy. And when Don and I were talking earlier, I think that the therapist, Karen McCarty, who helped me write the book, I mean, she didn't charge me. We just met over lunch. She was probably helping me even years later process some of it, although I thought the time took care of most of it. But I think writing about it did help me process even more.
Um, I've just recently heard of that therapy. It was on one of the reality shows that I happened to watch, and someone had had a very traumatic experience, and it was a break-in in her home, and that was the therapy. And I remember thinking, I don't understand this. Like, I don't understand what they're doing, because of course they don't have the time to take you through the process. So when I came upon it again, when I was doing my research for our conversation, I was like, oh, I had the revelation, like, oh, okay. But now, of course, you explained it much better. I still didn't understand how it worked, but you explained it it's very interesting. And is it more readily available now?
I think,
Like,
well, when I was doing my book talk, I found, and this was back in 2017, 18 timeframe, I found about one person in the group knew about it. So I don't think it's that well known.
mhm,
Um, it took me a while to find a therapist who did EMDR specifically, but
mhm,
I would say I couldn't even give a percentage, but there are therapists that are learning it more and more.
mhm,
And it doesn't always work for everybody, because what happens is that image is supposed to morph and transform. And so what I write about in the book, when Laura goes through the therapy, is realistic, because I had the therapist proof
mhm.
it and make sure what I was describing was accurate. So if you want to learn more about how it actually works, you can read the book with Laura's experience and see how it works.
Mhm.
And
Very
you can
cool.
specifically look up therapists with EMDR in
Mhm.
their list of credentials.
Yeah, because as you said, it's relatively new. It was, just honestly, well, actually the 80s were a little
The,
bit longer ago than I want to
the 80s feels
remember.
like yesterday, doesn't
I
it?
know, wasn't that just last month?
Right.
No, no. I have a very significant reunion coming up, and I graduated in 83, so I'm well aware of how long ago the 80s were. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit more about Pleas for Justice, because like I had mentioned in your first book, there were all these, like controversial and I feel like tough conversations that you were having. And so likewise in Plea for Justice. So tell us just a little bit again, don't give we the purpose of this program is to
Not to
get
give it
our
away, right?
authors' books off the shelves and in the hands of readers. So we don't want spoilers. But tell us a little bit about that story as well. It's fascinating.
So complete fiction. And it's not a series. People sometimes think my books are series because the covers have similar fonts.
Mhm,
But it's about a young girl named Jackie, who's is kind of not the popular girl in high school. She has her best friend Aaron is the cool jock, but they don't acknowledge that at high school. That's after hours, after school, that they hang out. And after high school, he just dumps her. No explanation, which hurts her feelings because he's really the only friend she had. And 10 years later, he is arrested and accused of murdering a girl. The media dubs him the Snapchat killer because he allegedly posted photos and video of the girl before he killed her. And instead of going to trial, he takes a plea deal and goes to prison. So from prison, he gets access to a phone, reaches out to Jackie because he's found out that she became a paralegal. So he reaches out to her 10 years later, begging her to help. So of course she can't resist the temptation to go find out, why did he ice her the way he did, and did he really kill the girl? So it's
mhm.
told from Jackie's point of view as she investigates the trial that never happened, and she just looks at the evidence. And then it's told from another character's point of view, who I call Me, who is the killer. But you don't know if that's Aaron or not until the end.
Mhm. So very interesting concept, I think, because you don't go into the trial side of it at all, and you deal with it strictly, post post trial and all that. I think that's just like through research and revisitation. And so, but some of the tough things that you talk about, the privacy, right to privacy, our online exposure, I guess hacking, people being able to impersonate us online and things. Also the weapons rights, gun rights and carry permits. You talk about body image a little bit in that one.
Yeah, you're making me realize I got pretty deep. I didn't think I had. Well, just because I never give Jackie's weight, but she doesn't have a good self-image, and it grows. Her confidence grows as she investigates the case and as she takes the RAD class. And so I wanted to show that arc of Jackie getting stronger from this girl who had no self-confidence to having confidence. And then on the when people ask me which of my 3 books should they give to their like college age daughter, I say Plea for Justice, because the bad guy was able to nab the girl that he killed by getting access to her phone. And he pretended he was taking photos, but he actually put spyware on her phone. And everything that he did is something that can be done. So the software he put on was meant for parents to track their children, but there's no stopping a bad guy from putting it on your phone if you don't know what he's doing. So I brought up a lot of the IT things and the cyber stalking that you can do, and how to be more aware and more vigilant. And then with the gun piece was in the first book, Laura learned to shoot. And it wasn't that I was either pro-gun or anti-gun. I just wanted to show what her experience was because she wanted more self-protection. So she learned to shoot. So I thought, well, what's the next thing I want to explore? And I was getting my carry permit at the same time. So Jackie's getting her carry permit when I was actually going through that process.
And I hate it when that happens. The thought escapes me. But I think where I was going with it is we have so far in your books, we have the law twice, right? We have the legal system of in Free of Malice, was jury selection, like that process,
Right.
and now we have a paralegal and going through that process. So for someone who is not a lawyer, this is kind of impressive.
People think I'm a lawyer. I know. I have great experts that have helped me. I think the biggest compliments I get on the book, well, I get page turner, but I also get that for people who are in that vocation, they think I'm one of them. But I worked with Allison Frutos was the lawyer who helped me the most in the first 2, in Free of Malice for sure, but in both books. And she's a criminal defense lawyer in Douglas County. And same thing, we would meet over lunch and I would put the recorder down and just pick her brain on how things work. And she was so gracious of her time and so smart. So especially for the Thomas character in Free of Malice, I mean, if you think he's clever, it's because of Allison.
Oh,
and
great.
She helped me as well with all the habeas corpus that comes up in Plea for Justice, which is the prisoner trying to get out of jail or be freed once he's already been jailed.
So now let's talk about your most recent publication, and it was published during the pandemic.
21, right?
Yeah.
Came out in April of 21.
And so how did that impact you being able to promote it and to, you have a website and you have a following now, but as far as like getting it out there and letting people know, hey, I've written another book during this really trying time frame.
It's actually done the best. It by far has the most reviews. So I don't know if that's that people had more time to read, or if I had the first 2 books did start to get the fan base, or if the cover's great. Who knows what makes someone pick up a book, but it's by far done the best. And it's, as you pointed out, it's not so much legal. This one is criminal. And for this one, I worked with Gepfer, who had been my RAD instructor. She was a police detective, community outreach officer, captain. And so she and I spent hours together with me asking her questions from the viewpoint of Detective Grant, who is working on a murder case. So anything that a detective would do, Jennifer told me. So if you think, oh, well, something's not realistic in the book, it is, because as a detective, she told me exactly what she would do.
That's great. That's great that you have those types of connections that help you, form your stories so that they are realistic and believable. So tell us what is the premise of Shades of Silence?
So this one is about a woman named Juliana. She's a restaurant owner in Florida. I decided, because my first two books were in Georgia, and I decided I better expand a little
I was wondering
outside of Georgia.
too.
And I lived, with GE. Now that they sent me to Daytona Beach. I set this one in Ormond Beach because I knew the area. She's a restaurant owner. Her husband has been missing for several months. He's a pilot, and the plane has disappeared. And I wanted to do that because, to me, worse than grieving is not knowing if you can grieve. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Holding out hope, right? Do you hold out hope? When do you give up hope? But a young girl shows up in her restaurant after hours and says, shows up out of nowhere and says, we need to talk. He's not who you think he is. And before Juliana can ask her any more questions, a bullet comes through the window and kills the girl. So the book is told from Juliana's point of view, where she's dealing with the aftermath of a woman being shot in her restaurant and all the trauma that comes from that. Her husband's missing, and then it's told from the point of view of Detective Grant, who is investigating the murder. And it alternates chapters back and forth, which some people got confused by, but that's a fairly common practice, but it alternates 2 points of view.
So you change things up a little bit with this one by having the 2 points of view, and you have the killer's point of view.
I had me, right? Yeah, I had Jackie and me, so I followed that. It was also two points of view.
Okay, so was it harder to try to write from a male's police officer point of view, or was it just as easy to write from the female victim point of view?
Well, I'd had practice, right? It was harder to write from me's point of view because he was a killer and he's a psychopath.
Right. And you don't know anybody like that to say, am I getting this right?
My friends are afraid of me after they read that one. They're like, how did that get in your head to make something so diabolical? I couldn't tell. I couldn't tell if he was too diabolical or not enough. Like I couldn't. But I read, the best book I read for that one was called Anatomy of Motive by John Douglas, who was an FBI profiler, and he had interviewed some of the worst. And I read that book cover to cover, and then I wrote the me character. But I also had a really good editor who told me that some of my language was too feminine. Like he said something about, like, she had a drink and you wanted to get drinks, and she said, no, you got to say shots. Like, she found just little nuances in the words that I used that were too female. And so she helped me basically manify that character. And that stuck with me as I worked with Jennifer. But Jennifer's also worked around a lot of males, so it wasn't hard for her to portray Grant from a male energy.
So for this book, what do you kind of feel like the tough subjects are? Because I think there are still, again, some, deeper stories and deeper thought-provoking things in Shades of Silence.
I kind of surprised the reader at the end, and I probably should do a warning about it because it touches on sex trafficking quite a bit, especially at the end. And you find out that the girl who had been shot maybe was involved in that. And so I did a lot of research on sex trafficking, which I didn't know much about. I thought it was what happens in other countries. I didn't even realize Atlanta was a hub, especially during the Super Bowl. And so everything I put in there about realism of sex trafficking and how to notice it and how to prevent it is accurate.
So I feel like, too, based on what we're hearing from you, is that in each of your books, there's something to learn. There's something to kind of take away that sticks with you, and it comes from a safety perspective. And I don't know that that's intentional or if that's just how it has worked out with, for you in your writing. But I find that very, very, very interesting. And so,
it's intentional, and I appreciate you noticing. It's intentional.
Good.
Every book has a educational and social theme.
I love knowing that. So let's talk about what you're working on next, because I can only imagine where Liz Lazarus is going to take us next.
I say this with every book, so it'll probably be true on the next. This is my best one yet, but I say that with every book. So, but this one I think is my best one yet. It's a stalker story. So my main character is named Dawn, and when you reached out to me to do that, I just keep getting all these little signals about I'm on the right path. But the main character is named Dawn, named for several Dawns in my life. But the main person was Dawn Hillier, who had a stalker for 10 years. And she and I became friends as I went through my book tour for Free of Malice. And so I listened to her story. And what I decided to do was interview several women who've had stalkers. So my bad guy is a combination of all of their stories. So he's as bad as he's clever, which makes him really dangerous, and he's diabolical. And he's the combination of several stalkers. So you have one guy who's bad, but you get 10 girls who've had stalkers, and put all their stories together, it makes him really off the charts. Mm-hmm. And so they date briefly. She decides to break it off, and he doesn't accept that, and all the tactics that he pulls after that, including going after her family, which is what they do sometimes. If they can't mm-hmm. get to you, they go after the things you love. I'm wow. about 50,000 words in, so I'm trying to get to 80,000. Mm-hmm. And I tell you, the only thing I worry about with this book is it is so dark. Like, are people going to be able to tolerate it? Now, I do bring some levity because she's a vet tech. So Charlie, with your cat, she's a vet tech. And as usual, I've been able to find an expert to help me. And Rebecca Smith, who I met actually when I was doing my consulting work, my day job, I met her, and she's a vet tech. She was also a rad tech, radiology tech, which is how I found out, how I met her. But I've been interviewing her. We probably have about 10 or 15 vet stories in the book because she's a vet tech. And it's so fun to interview her. I laugh every time we talk, and I put in great stories that are realistic, and she shares them with her colleagues as I'm writing the book, because I always give her the chapter after I've written it, and she's like, oh my gosh, spot on. There are gonna be so many vet techs that are nodding their heads at what you're describing.
So what's this one named? Have you decided on a name and a title?
I haven't released it yet, but I will tell you.
Okay.
I will tell you Dawn is in the title.
Okay. All right. So you kind of touched on this earlier about that there's similarities in the covers of your book. And I have also noticed that there's similarities in the title of your books. Okay. So I'm kind of curious, are we going to kind of follow the same path?
You're okay. Good. Man, you do your homework. Yes.
Okay, cool.
It's a one syllable noun, a pronoun, and a 2-syllable noun. And I guess I'll quit writing. I came up with that with Sue Grafton, mm-hmm. how she went through the alphabet. I thought that the same font, the same alliteration helps people identify a book.
And I agree with it. You've reminded me of an author I read recently, and I was so thrown by her 2 books because the covers were completely different, the fonts were completely different, and it's just interesting because I was going to bring this up in Sisters in a chapter meeting and just kind of mention, like, what do authors think about this? Because I think to me as a reader, I think there is a benefit to be able to identify an author and go, oh, that looks like so-and-so. Oh, it is, oh, they've got a new book out. So as a reader, I like it. I'm curious how other readers, might feel about that. Like I said, I think it's something we can explore as a chapter and talk a little bit more about what I call the business of writing, of being an author, and how all that goes. I can't believe this hour's on
fast.
It's been great. You're working. We're going to go back to your personal life real quick. You started a consulting business. You're working with.
Well, when I left GE, I joined a consulting firm, with one of my buddies from Kellogg was the CEO, and I did that for several years. And one of my consulting clients lured me away to help with the startup, and so I did that the last 3 years. Just finished that in June, and so now I'm helping a different startup founded by 2 doctors. What we do is help improve lung biopsy rate diagnosis rates. So these 2 doctors who had gone to the Stanford Biodesign program came up with the idea. We're in the early phase of getting our seed funding. And so I'm kind of bringing the business angle to them already bringing the medical angle. And it's great. They're so intelligent. So it's great to work with them.
Well, it really is fascinating. Your whole life is fascinating. And we talked a little bit already about how the law and police procedure play into your stories. And yet you have this fascinating medical background too. Are we going to see any of that, do you think, eventually?
Yeah, I never know what my next book's going to be, but yeah, maybe something. Now that I've got access to these 2 doctors for experts, maybe something in that field.
Yeah.
A friend of mine who's a cardiologist has written a book, and I've read it. So the other thing I do sometimes help others. I've read his and given him a ton of content editing feedback. That would be a tough one. I mean, that would be probably the toughest thing of all, to write a medical book, but who knows? I'll have to think about that once this one's done.
And do you see yourself continuing to write? Do you think that we're going to have 10 plus Liz Lazarus books on our shelves?
I guess. I guess. As long as I've got an idea and the readers, I mean, the most terrifying thing was putting out Plea for Justice, because you don't want to disappoint readers. Like if they loved your first one and don't like your second one.
Right.
So as long as I can keep the caliber of the books to the level that I think is good, then I'll keep doing it.
And I get that too, because as we already established, your first book, that intention of that book was, to tell a story and to expose this situation. And so then the second book was fiction, and you were pulling that from what, like news reports, an idea, somebody said something, it sparked a thought, like,
I'm trying to remember. I think it was just more me trying to think about what would make a sympathetic character. And that's how Jackie evolved, which is someone who didn't have good self-confidence. And the rad class started that one. And then the third one was a friend who gave me the opening scene. And she's like, I'm never going to write this book, but here's an opening scene in a restaurant that I thought would be interesting. And on a flight, I pretty much kind of started to outline, okay, well, how can I take that scene, which is great. It's a great opener. You want to hear what this girl has to say, and she's killed. And the one I'm doing now, Stalker Story, I already knew. And the elder abuse is my social theme in the one I'm doing now.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, you really do take us, through a path. So it's fascinating. I thank you so much for sharing your Saturday morning with us. I thank everybody who tuned in. We had a good audience. Let's just wrap it up, Liz, with one more question, and then I'll make a couple of announcements. What are you currently reading? Like, do you have time when you're writing to read for pleasure?
I'm reading How to Raise Private Equity. It's true. And I know, but I do. I like Michael Robotham. I always like his books. He's not well known because he's a British author, but he always has great twist endings. So I just read one of his. I think it was called Good Girl, Bad Girl. So that's the last last fiction book I read, but right now I'm kind of deep into business stuff.
You like the twist endings?
I love twist endings.
Yeah.
If 2 conditions, if they make sense, and if I can't guess them.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
If you throw in a twist ending just for a twist ending of something that's never plausible, then I get irate. So
you get annoyed, don't you?
They have to be earned.
Right.
Yes.
Right. All right. So before we sign off, does anybody have any questions for Liz? Please. Gary wants to know who wrote Anatomy of Motive. You had mentioned.
Yes, John Douglas. He's a FBI profiler, retired. brace yourself. And do I have the book? I think I have the ebook. I'll be happy to forward it to you. You can loan one ebook. Yeah, it's brutal. The interviews he had.
Mm. All right. So just a
I have a
couple.
question.
Oh, yes.
Where do you find your people that you talk to about helping you with your story? I mean, you're in the business world and so you meet a lot of people, but if you aren't doing that, how do you reach out and get input?
Great question. I like for the lawyer to find Allison, I just started looking up lawyers and cold emailing them, telling them I was an author and I was trying to do research. And it took about 20 cold requests to come across her. But you'll find people like her and like Gepfer who think it's so cool to work with an author. So you just, you have at bats, you have to just keep trying to find the person you need. When it came to, I needed a pilot, I reached over to PDK to find out if I could talk to, I'm a private pilot, very rusty, but I needed a charter pilot for Shades of Silence. So I called over to the airport to see if they could recommend somebody. Just be brazen, I guess, just keep reaching out and understand some people say no, it's crazy. And some people will be thrilled and honored to work with you.
Cool. Okay. Thank you.
And if you've got some contacts you need, give me a shout. I can maybe help you think about who I know or who you could brainstorm to reach out to get that expertise.
Well, thank you.
I wouldn't worry about your darkness.
No?
Karen Slaughter is an art of that.
Now, I love Karen Slaughter's work. She's a bit more gory than I ever go. I just can't, like when my bad guy, he kills the girl in 5 words. 5 words, that's it. I can't go too gory because I can't read that stuff because it stays with me.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I don't want it to stay with me.
Yeah. I read like 3 Karen Slaughters in a row and I was like, need a break.
Yeah.
Need a break.
Yeah.
Is there a cozy I can read?
Yeah.
Next, yeah. So, all right. So before we go, just a couple of announcements. If you are not on our email distribution for Off the Shelf, please put your email address in the chat and I will add you to that. We also have a readers forum that we do once a month. And that is just like a fireside chat. It's a casual conversation where we talk about what we're reading or maybe what we're watching. Like if there's a good Netflix, series. It tends to stay in the mystery, crime, suspense genre, but we do that once a month as well. And so I can add you to that distribution list. And the readers programs, you do not have to be a member of Sisters in Crime to participate. They are open to the public, which is why I need your email address if you're not on our member list. And then Liz's website is also in the chat, so please make note of that. And we can buy your books. Like if we click on it, it'll take us to where we can buy the book, right?
Wait, I don't sell them off my website. It just
right.
But yeah, they link
It'll
to Amazon. And I'll tell you right now, if you have Kindle Unlimited, Plea for Justice and Shades of Silence are on Kindle Unlimited. We haven't done that for Free of Malice yet because we're actually talking about redoing the cover. But yeah, so Kindle Unlimited, and actually Shades of Silence has a Prime deal, which Amazon came to me about and said, they'll pay me a certain amount to put it on Prime. So those are hopefully easy to get and free if you've got those memberships.
Good to know. And then also in November, the Atlanta chapter of Sisters in Crime is having a short story workshop. It's an all-day workshop. I think it's on the 12th of November. It's at the Decatur Library. And it's inexpensive. Lunch is included. And I put a link to that in the chat. If you are interested in attending, we would love to have you. All right, so I'm going to sign off. Yes, Liz, thank you so much. You are a fascinating interview, and I'm so grateful that you spent your Saturday with us today. I hope everybody has a great day, and we will see you soon.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Good job.
You're fabulous.
Thanks.
No, I mean, you do such a good job, really.
Well, thank you. I appreciate
I mean,
it.
you've done your research, your questions flow naturally.
Well,
Yeah,
good.
you're great.
You're easy to talk to. You are. And there's so many places we could have gone, and I kept trying to look at the clock and I'm like, oh no, we're gonna run out of time.
Mhm.
So
No, well, let me know how I can help you get this broader because this is, and
thank you.
I'll be joining from now on. You do such a good interview.
Great. Thank you. And feel free, like if you do join us, feel free to jump in and, like if there's a question or you want to take that conversation with that author in a direction, please, it's not supposed to just be me. I'm just supposed to kind of moderate, but it ends up being me. And I don't know if that's because I dominate or if people are just being shy and quiet.
People are used to the format where they come and watch. So
Right.
I don't think it's you dominating. I think
Okay.
people are used to the format. They come and watch and they get, they get to watch a show.
Yeah. So, well, thank you again. Have a great rest of your Saturday. Angela is the one who puts this on YouTube for us.
Okay.
So she's out of town, but I'll poke her about that so that we can get you the link and then you can, share it on your social media if you want. And
Okay.
then when you get that book written, your Dawn book, we're gonna
My Dawn book.
back.
I mean, the fact that you asked, there's so many little signs like that. Just tell me I got to keep going. I got to get back to writing because I was working too much this week. So I get, but this weekend I'm going to do some more writing.
And that was a question I meant to ask was like, how do you find time with what you do? How do you find time to also write? And then when you said you can get a book together in such a short amount of time, when I have heard authors like, Wanda Morris told us it took her like 2 years to write her book, and I'm like, wow. So when you said that, I was like, oh my gosh, wow, that's fascinating.
For me, it's 6 months is about right. So I got, when I left Control Rad, which was the first startup, in June, I said by the end of this year, I need to be done. So,
you got a few more months.
Yeah, I got 50,000 words. And the thing is, I'm not a pantser. I'm a plotter. So I know what I have to write. So, and I don't always have to, I think the other thing is I don't always have to write in order because I know what I have to write.
Right.
So if you get stuck somewhere, I just skip it and go to the next thing and come back.
You know what and that's another thing that I thought was really, really interesting when you talked about like the spreadsheets and stuff. And in my mind, I thought that's a potential workshop too, or a session for us to kind of pick your brain and your mythology and how you like map out a book and everything. I think that could be helpful to people. So,
well, and I also do it for the characters. So I have a separate tab that's got everything, their height, who they look like, who they sound like, what they drive, where they live, where they go to school. But I think, that's normal, I think, for most authors. I just started doing it so I wouldn't give someone the wrong car halfway through.
Right. But that does happen, right? Like we hear about that too in stories, like, oh, she's supposed to be a blonde and now which we can change her hair color. So that doesn't.
Yeah. No, but it's that consistency. But it's just two things. It's the consistency, but it's also, it gets deep into the character. If you can start talking about like, what do they want? And who do they look like? Who do they sound like? Like I really go deep into their psyche. So I can, and also just like their little mannerisms. So not to overdo them because you don't want to overdo mannerisms, but to have a few of them that make that character unique.
Yeah, so we could talk forever.
We could. Again, I've done a lot of these. You were top notch, truly.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. All right. Well, have a good day, and we'll see you soon.
All right. Sounds good.
All right. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.